As we begin today, there are probably a variety of expressions we could use to explain why Jesus came, what his mission was, the purpose for which God sent him. But I love the direct statement that John makes in chapter 3 of 1 John. It's in verse 8. You can see it there on the screen. It says this: the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. Anybody else like that? I love that. The reason the Son of God came was to destroy the devil's work. What is the devil's work? John himself actually sums that up in another passage where he says the devil's work is related to sin and to death. He comes to steal and kill and destroy. Do you know what the greatest irony in all of history is? That Jesus himself took on our sin so that he could destroy sin, and then he himself died, went before us in death, so that he could destroy death. Isn't that awesome? The reason Jesus came was to destroy the devil's work of sin and death. And in fact, when we receive Christ into our hearts, what he does is he comes, forgives us of sin, and gives us eternal life. Aren't you glad for that? That's what he does in our lives. But much of the book of John is committed to this very important question and really kind of this mystery that all of us must face, which is this mystery of trying to understand the role or the position of sin in the lives of people who actually know God. Another way to say it might be this: if I'm a Christian and I love God, if I'm a Christian and God has forgiven me for my sins, how do I deal with an ongoing struggle that happens sometimes in my life to do wrong? Can any of you kind of acknowledge that today? And does that ring a bell with any of you? That even though we love God, we still wrestle with this struggle sometimes to do wrong, to sin, to disobey God. And so we easily become confused because as John addresses this throughout this letter, it seems like he goes back and forth with some things that we really aren't sure we understand. Like, for example, John says, little children, I write this to you so that you will not sin. And so we say, okay, so sin has no place in the life of a believer. But then he turns around and he says, but if anybody does sin, they have an advocate with the Father. So you're like, okay, so maybe a believer can sin. Or in another place, John says, you know what? If you sin, you're not of God. And then he turns around and says, nobody should say that they don't sin, because anybody who says that they don't sin make God out to be a liar. And after a while, you're reading all this, and your response is kind of, huh? I'm not quite sure I track with this. What's going on? How can I understand how in the world I, as a believer, deal with sin? And so in the minutes that we have together, I want to take just some time, I think, to really help you to come to a place where you'll understand God's call on our life to be righteous and how we deal with sin in our lives. All right, can you walk this with me today? Now, there's a bit of theology here, but more of it is just extremely practical for dealing with these things in our life. So the place we need to start is this. If you're going to understand this, understand not all sin is the same in God's eyes. I want you to read that with me. Not all sin is the same in God's eyes. This is something that sometimes believers become confused about. It's like, well, sin is sin. Right is right and wrong is wrong. So sin is sin. So every sin is the same in God's eyes. Actually, that's not true. And in fact, if you think about your own experience of life and how we, as creations of God, deal with wrongdoing, you would clearly understand that this is a true statement. For example, in this room today, down at South, I want to see your hands as well. How many of you would dare to lift your hand and say, I am a lawbreaker? Raise your hands. I'm a lawbreaker. All right? Kind of look, hey, come on, put them back up. Look around. There's a lot of hands. Not everybody, though. I'm a lawbreaker, right? All right, you can put your hands down. Now, for those of you who did not lift your hands, can I tell you something? Did you know that speed limits are laws? So, someone else just pointed at someone else. Now I know my wife's a lawbreaker. Thank you. I can work with her on the way. Okay, so what we're saying is, if you've ever gone 56 in a 55, if you've ever done 32 in a 30, you are a lawbreaker. You are. The law said 30, you did 32. You are a lawbreaker. You should have put your hand up. Now, here's the thing. Did you know to murder is to break a law? Did you know our laws say you cannot murder? So if you murder, you're a lawbreaker. So, how many of you really think, don't even bother lifting your hands to this, how many of you think that we ought to look at people who have broken a speed limit and think about how we should deal with that in the same way that we should deal with someone in our society who murders? We recognize immediately that those are not equal in some sense, even though we would define both those things as breaking the law. Now, let's think about this spiritually. Did you know the Bible says in 1 Corinthians that our bodies were bought by God at a price, and we should honor God with our bodies? And so it instructs us clearly, you have to honor God with how you treat your body. Is there anybody here who's ever been full before, but still ate a second piece of dessert anyway? Can I see your hands? Come on. And you can point to your husband if you know, all right? You ever done that? Now, you were full, but you still ate. You know what that's called? That's called gluttony. Because you ate and you didn't need to eat, and you just kept on eating and you kept on eating. You know what? That's disobedience, because that is bad for your body. You'll notice I raised my hand. When you entertain yourself so late at night that you regularly keep yourself from the sleep you need, when you say I have to work so much that I can't sleep, or when you begin to do all these other things that relate to our body and you do those things, do you know what? You've broken the law of God. Because God says that we are supposed to honor his temple, and he gives us a direct instruction, and you disobeyed God. Disobedience to God. That's sin. Right? Follow me. That's sin. All right? Now, it is also sin to murder, to rape, to kidnap, grand larceny. Those things are also sin. Do you understand why I say to you today that not all sin is the same in God's eyes? Because there's not one of us who would say, you know what, someday in eternity, when God judges those who have unrepentant sin, that he somehow is going to equally judge the person who overate some or didn't exercise the way they should have, and the person who murdered or raped or kidnapped or blasphemed. So what began a little confusing actually is very clear, isn't it? We can start there, can't we? Nod your head if you're with me tonight. That certainly it makes sense that not all sin is the same in God's eyes. And so in actuality, what you discover is in the New Testament, there are 10 different words for sin. 10 different words for sin. And these words for sin, they mean all kinds of things. For example, the one word for sin means missing the mark. Another word for sin means willfully disobeying God. Another word for sin means to travel down the wrong path, to depart from the way. Sometimes sin means to fall short. So there are all sorts of things that this means. But John Wesley, who gave a lot of consideration to all these different ideas of sin and how we deal with sin in our lives, he was very helpful to us, because he said when you really take all these concepts of sin, of disobedience to God, they really break down into two categories. Two categories. The first category is willfully disobeying God. Knowing what God has called us to do. Knowing how we're supposed to live. He's revealed it to us. This series is called Walking in the what? In the light. So he shines that light in your life. You say, I'm a child of God and I want to obey him, and so this is my will and we're going for it. But then something comes up, a temptation comes your way, and you know it's wrong, and you know God's telling you it's wrong, but you willfully say, even though I know that God has told me no, I'm still going to do it. Even though God's told me yes, I'm not going to do it. John Wesley says that's willful disobedience. And if you remain in that way, you walk away from God. And then he says there are also what we would call frailties, infirmities, faults, shortcomings, missings of the mark. You know, God, I really meant to honor you all day long, and I told you I was going to trust you, but that situation came up, and I feared anyway. Lord, you know, I didn't mean to be stingy, but I was stingy. I didn't mean to be thoughtless with my husband, but I was. Shortcomings. Short of the glory of God. Some way you thought, some way you behaved that you know full well is short of the holiness of God. Now, as we're talking about this idea of what place does sin have in our life, if you are going to say when we're talking about sin that we're referring to every time you fall short in any way, then we would have to all buy into the fact that there's never going to be any full release from that until you die. Because we're all going to fall short in some way. However, listen to this hopeful message concerning sin that John's trying to get through to us. If we recognize willful disobedience to God as the kind of sin that John was saying, I write to you so that you won't do that, then there is this tremendously hopeful thing that falls into our lap in this passage, because it says this: as you walk in the light, you can actually get to the place where you don't have to willfully choose to disobey God. In other words, people misinterpret this as if to say, when someone starts to say, I want to pursue a perfect heart, it's like we all get nervous about that word perfect, and we think what they mean is, I want to get to where I never could mess up in any way, I could never fall short. That's not what we're talking about. However, what we are saying is this: being a Christian and learning to walk in more light doesn't mean I can't sin, but it does mean I can come to a place in my life where my will is bending towards God in such a way that I can choose not to. See how hopeful that is? Kind of quiet in here. It ought to be getting a little louder in here, because that's a very hopeful thing. And so John says to us, I'm telling you, we can learn to deal with willful sin in our lives and become victorious over it. And he says, this is how I'm going to show you how we deal with sin in our lives. And so he walks us through this chapter in such a way that actually, as it progresses, it does kind of a neat thing. And so we're going to do this today, but I want you to just kind of pretend that this is a house with 4 rooms in it, all right? This is a house with 4 rooms, and I'm going to show you how God works in our lives as we grow in him. And so probably what we need to do is put a little door here. For those of you who ever look at thing, you know, it's a little symbol for a door, because there comes a moment in our lives where we invite Jesus into this house. All right? It's a moment we call it salvation. And by the way, you have study guides in your bulletins. You might want to pull those out right now, because you can write on them. And in fact, we can just do this right now. If you don't have a bulletin and you would like a study guide to do this along with me, because there's some things we're going to do, you just raise your hand right now, and I'm going to keep talking. If you put your hand up, someone's going to come and bring it to you right now. The rest of you, they're inside of your bulletin. You can grab them. We've got pens in the seat pockets, and here we go. So, room number 1. With this, and right over here, you might just want to write salvation here, but it is we invite Jesus to come into our lives. And when we do that, we're discovering whose I am. Write that in that top left corner box, would you? And that is 1 John 3:1. It's the very first verse. Let's put it up on the screen, and you can look at it with me. In fact, let's read it together, because Pastor Shane told you how excited John was about this. And so read this out loud with me. Say it with me. How great is the love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. So, the first thing we discover is whose I am, who I belong to. Let me put it this way. If we took spiritual paternity tests today, every one of you would discover your spiritual father is God. We all got the same dad. How about that? No wonder we all look so alike, right? No wonder we're all so good looking, right? Because we would discover spiritually we all have God for a father. And he is not a deadbeat dad. Come on, church. He's not a deadbeat dad. He's a good father. He's a loving father. But we are estranged children. We are prodigal children who have run away from him. And so the Father is our Father. And when we will discover how much he loves us, that he is our Father, he is waiting for us to come into relationship with him, to open the door and let him into the house. Revelation 3:20 says it this way. Look, I've been standing at the door, and I'm constantly knocking. If anyone hears me calling him and opens the door, I will come in and fellowship with him, and he with me. So here's the first step, folks. The first step to dealing with sin in our lives is first to be forgiven of sin. To invite Jesus to come into our lives, to discover whose I am, that we are the children of God. And so you might say it this way. It's kind of like Jesus gets in as far as where guests do in your life. You know, a guest comes over to your house, they get access to the living room, and maybe they stand with you in the kitchen while you're cooking, or you go to the dining room or the area where you eat, and guests get a certain amount of access, but you do let them in. You let them into your life, and Jesus says, you know what, I'm waiting to be that guest in your life. And so Jesus comes into our lives, and that's the place where we begin. But here's what I want you to know. Guests leave, Jesus doesn't. Come on, someone should have gotten happy about that. Guests leave, but what? Jesus doesn't. And so Jesus is not interested in being the guest of your life. When he says, I'm standing at the door knocking, he doesn't mean so I can come in for a day or a week or a month. He wants to spend himself upon you, and he wants you to spend your life with him in the middle of it. And so he comes in, but when he comes in, he says, you know what? I don't want you to seclude me to just one room. There's more work that I want to do than that. And so he says, let me continue a work in your life. And so he moves on down to this second one. And so this second room says this, what I don't do. Write that into that blank there. And we're going to put that scripture up on the screen for you. And it says this, no one who is born of God will continue to sin, because God's seed remains in him. He cannot go on sinning because he has been born of God. So this is verse 9. So what happens? Jesus comes into our life, and then he says this, you know what? There's some things I want to talk to you about. There's some good things I want to do in your life. And that's going to include the fact that I'm going to point to some things, and I'm going to begin to bring some conviction in your life and say, you know what? That's not good for you. That's not good for anyone else. That's not good for our relationship. You need to stop doing those things because those are sin, and they don't belong in the life of someone who's a child of the one true King. And so he says, you know what? You need to stop doing that. Now, let me remind you one more time. We're talking here about willful disobedience. His blood covers those other infirmities and those things, as even those things we learn to grow and get better at. But he begins to say, I want to work, give this word, a sanctifying work in your life. You know what sanctify means? It means to be set apart. God says, I want to start to set you apart so that you start to look different than you've ever looked before. So that your heart begins to bend towards me, not away from me. He says, I want you to learn how to obey. I'll share a story. Maybe some of you have heard it before, but it's a great Mother's Day story. And when I was about 10 years old, my brother Jay would have been 8. My brother Chad was 7. 3 older brothers older than me. We were the 3 youngest. And it was about this time of year. It was May, and we loved baseball growing up. And so, we just couldn't wait to get our mitts on when we get home from school and things like that. Get out, throw the ball, hit the ball. We had a great side yard to play ball in. And I remember one Saturday morning, we got up. We were ready to go charging out and play baseball. But my mom said, guys, I can't have you go outside. I need to just run somewhere real quick. And I was almost 11, at that time. And so my mom said, hey, Todd, I need you just to be in charge for just a couple minutes while I'm gone. You can handle this. Everybody else is gone. I just need to run somewhere real quick. I'll be right back. But I don't want you to go outside. She said specifically, I don't want you to go outside and play baseball because it's kind of raining and we got to travel tomorrow and sing. And I don't want any of you getting sick, so stay in the house. Okay, Mom, I got you covered. You can count on me, right? You can count on me. And I really was the best child, so she did. And so off she went. And so she left, and I'm up in the one room, and my 2 brothers are down in the room we used to call the rec room. I think it means recreation, but it's just because we left at a rec most of the while. And so I went down. Jay and Chad were just kind of sitting there minding their own business, doing some stuff. And I came down. I said, hey, guys, I got an idea. And they said, what? I said, let's play baseball. And they said, we can't play baseball. I said, yes, we can. And they said, no, Mom clearly said we can't play baseball. I said, no, she didn't. I said, Mom said we can't play baseball outside. And so we created this game. To this day, indoor baseball, best game ever been created. And to understand it, you have to kind of understand the house that I grew up in, because you could come in the front door there, and there was a foyer there, and it led over here into the rec room. But 3 steps up from the foyer, there was a room here, and it was called the living room. And I don't know why we called it the living room, because no living got done in that room. Have you ever had a room like that? The carpet's too nice to walk on. Kids aren't allowed in it. Don't sit on the couch. It was that kind of room. That's where all my mom's most treasured little trinkets were and all that, you know. Now, straight over, when you went up the stairs, living room, straight over there was an opening, no door, just an opening, and through that opening you could go into the kitchen. Your standard kitchen, linoleum, dishwasher, table, all that good stuff. And so these are the rooms that matter for this story. And this is how the game would work. I had a tennis ball because I was smart enough not to use a hard ball in the house. But I had a tennis ball. And what I would do is I would stand up there in the living room, because that's where all the action would take place, because Mom wasn't home. And so I would stand there. We found an old pizza box. We cut it out to make home plate, and we set it down there. And the way the game would work is this. Jay and Chad were playing against each other. And I would stand up there in the living room by the base with my mitt on. And what I would do is I'd stand this way, and one of them would be 3 steps down in the foyer, and then the other brother, he could see through there, and he would be standing in the kitchen, leaning with his foot back against the dishwasher. And what he would do is, I would throw the ball, and when I threw the ball, it would bounce down into the foyer, and it was the job of this guy down there to scoop the ball up and throw it back up to me. And meanwhile, the one who was in the kitchen, they could choose when to go. And one of those times when I threw it, they would start running as fast as they could, and they would come in, and they would slide, because it was good sliding carpet, and they would slide into home plate. And if they could slide in before this guy could field the ball, throw it back, and me tag them out, then they would get a point. Are we all clear on the game today? Best game ever. So we started playing. It was great. They put on their pajama bottoms. I don't know if you remember back in that day, but pajama bottoms used to be kind of this, the real like slippery kind of material, and I don't know what that stuff's called, but it was real slippery, polyester, and so they would come in. We played for so long. My mom must have gotten caught up in traffic or something, that we actually wore holes in the knees of our pajamas. So they went up and got tube socks, and we tied them around, you know. And so we go. So the score was 9-8, and Chad was down in the foyer, and Jay's in the kitchen. And if Chad can get Jay one more time out, he's going to win 9-8. So I threw the ball down. It bounced through Chad's legs. He's trying to find the ball and throw it back up. Meanwhile, here comes Jay. Now, Jay's always been kind of a short, stocky guy. And I know you're going to watch this, Jay. I love you. And, so Jay's in there. So picture kind of my short brother. Kind of picture Fred Flintstone-ish, if you will. And I like Fred Flintstone, don't you laugh? And so, Jay's trying to come, but on the linoleum floor, running in your socks, that's a little bit of a challenge. So he's trying to get his feet going. So finally he starts coming. He comes out of the kitchen. He's running full steam. Chad fields the ball, throws it up to me. I catch it. Here comes Jay. I've got him nailed dead to rights. Game's going to be over. Jay's eyes get real big. He realizes there's no way he's going to be safe. So he decides his only hope is to do a wraparound slide. Now, for those of you who don't know the deal, wraparound slide, instead of going in feet first, what you do is you kind of go in and you kind of go sideways and let your body kind of skid around, and you try to slip your arm in. It gives less of you to tag. And so Jay comes in head first, wraparound slide. And as he wraps around, he's coming into the base. He wraps around. His legs go this way. His whole body is sliding. He actually slides around way beyond the base. And when he does, something catches, and his feet actually popped up, straight up in the air. Now, when his feet popped up, they came up underneath this strange thing that we had in our living room that I need to describe to you. In the 80s, a lot of people had them. And it starts with this big ring up top, and then it came down and it had this light, and then it had macrame. Is there anybody left in the room who knows what macrame is? It's like yarn, and there's this twisty, fancy yarn that came down, and it came down, and it's suspended about 20 inches off the floor, this great big piece of plate glass. And Jay's feet came up underneath that plate glass, and when they hit it, all the things that my mom had there, her most precious prized little things, dust collectors, they were all there, including, if you look on the screen, she had one of these. The hand-blown glass piano. Have you ever been to one of those stores and it says you break it, you bought it? Well, let me give you a hint. We bought it that day, baby. That thing jumped up off the thing, came down, smashed into 1,000 pieces. That was the end of the game. So what are we going to do? Because after 3 minutes of blaming each other, you got to do something else. And so I was like, I got an idea. So I said, someone go get your shoebox quick. And so they went up and they got the shoebox, and I got a little broom, and we went over and we swept every last little piece of that into the shoebox, and we put the lid on, and then we ran upstairs into one of my brother's rooms, and we set that baby on the bed, and we laid our hands on it, and we prayed for the healing of that piano. Because we were spiritual kids. And we opened the box, and it wasn't a piano. I said, who didn't have enough faith here? What's going on, you know? It's like, oh. We said, that's not going to work, so we did the next best thing. We hid it. Well, Mom came home, and one of my kids couldn't handle the guilt, and, you know, told what happened. And then Dad got home, and we received the proper reward for our behavior. Do you understand what that means? Am I allowed to still say the word spank in 2017? Because, let me tell you, I still remember that one. And you see, what got us into trouble is not how Jay slid. What got us into trouble wasn't just putting the pizza box in the wrong place. What got us into trouble was we disobeyed. We disobeyed. And can I tell you something? God loves you so much. He lays down his commands for you, and he says, listen, I'm in your life, and there are things you just ought not do. Will you obey me? Will you submit your will that wants to disobey and go your own way? Will you continually submit so that as you grow in holiness, your heart just begins to bend towards me instead of away? And you obey. And so Jesus comes to live in us, and he comes into our lives, and then he says, I need you to obey and do the things that you are supposed to do. But he's not done at just 2 rooms, because then he goes on and he says this, you know what? It's not just about what you don't do, but it also is about what I do. What I do. I messed up that T. I crossed a T twice and made it an I. Look what it says in verse 24. Those who obey his commands. Whoops, hang on, I'm the wrong verse. Back up, sorry, verse 16. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. If anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Dear children, let us love with words. Let us not love with just words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. So this is verses 16 to 19. So you can go back later and look at all this. John says to us clearly, listen, don't separate out being from doing. You can't just say, I'm going to be a Christian and never do anything about it. If disobeying God is what we call a sin of commission, you commit an act you shouldn't, then disobeying God's command to do what he's called us to do and not doing it is called the sin of omission. Jesus says, I'm in your life. I'm living in this house. Great. Now let me tell you something. The work I've done in your life isn't just for you. It's not just for you. In fact, think about it this way. If all God really wanted to do in our lives was forgive us from sin and set us free and give us heaven, then really we ought to just die right after we get saved. Right? Yeah, it would be salvation, palpitations, glorification. That'd be it. If that's all God wanted to do, save you and kill you off. But God says, no, I've left you here for more than just that. Serve and minister are synonymous words. We love to say, who are the ministers in real life? That's right. How are you serving? How are you ministering to somebody? If you say, Jesus, you're at work in my life, he says, good, then do the kind of things I've called you to do. Be willing. I remember years ago, there was this Christian song called Please Don't Send Me to Africa. It's the name of the song. And it's about, oh, God, I love you. I'll do anything for you, but just one thing, God, please don't send me to Africa. And the funny part is that my brother Greg and I used to ride down the road with that song, cranked up, singing, please don't send me to Africa. He's now been a missionary in Africa for like 25 years. Careful what you don't ask for. But, for some of us, please don't send me to Africa is just kind of goofy, but for some of us, the honest truth is we're like, please don't send me closer into the city. Please don't keep sending me into my work environment. God, please don't ask me to love my neighbor who doesn't even know you who spends Sunday doing the exact opposite of the kind of things that I do. God, please don't ask me to serve where I have to deal with people who are unclean or they don't smell good. God, please don't ask me to pass up on getting a new car this year because you want me to take that money and give it to the cause of something that the church is doing or something you've called me to do. God, please don't ask me to stop drinking Starbucks coffee or Mountain Dew so that I can pay $40 and send a water filter to Ecuador so that it can filter 500,000 gallons of water. God, please don't talk to me about that stuff because I just kind of really like my life, just kind of cruising along the way it is, and I love you and I'm doing my best not to sin. And God says, great, but this isn't just for you. I didn't come into your life just for you. He says, man, if you love your brother, how can you say you love God if you won't at least have pity on him? Don't just love with words or tongue, but with actions and with truth. And this takes us to our final scripture. We go into this final room right here. It says this, those who obey his commands live in him and he in them. And this is how we know that he lives in us. We know it by the Spirit he gave us. And here's what I want to call this last room, all right? You ready for this? I want us to call this last room, Who I Trust. And of course, we just read verse 24. Let me express it to you this way. In this room, there's a little closet. You know what? When you invite a guest over, even if they're a guest that's been over 2 or 3 times, would you find it a little odd if you were in cooking the dinner that you're going to share with your guests and you somehow look around the corner and they're not sitting on the couch anymore where you thought they were conversing with your family and you went and found out that they were rummaging through your closet? They were documenting what's in your medicine cabinet? Would that be a little awkward? Wouldn't that be a little like, but once someone's really fully trusted in your life, I mean, my kids run in and out of my closet. Unfortunately, I now have a son who wears the same size stuff as me, so he comes out of the closet with stuff that's mine. But you know what? When you really trust someone, they just have access to everything. They do. I don't tell my wife, honey, you can have keys to that car, but you can't have keys to this car. And you know what? I think some of us say, God, I love you, and I want my heart to bend towards you, and I want to go out and do the things you've called us to do, but God, I'm just not sure I trust you enough to really give you that. What is that? Here's the thing. That might be something different for a whole bunch of us. But everybody's got a that. Like, God, you got 97.6%, but I get the closet. I got the key to it. And I don't open that for anybody. That's just me and for me alone. And God comes to you and says, listen, I love you. Will you trust me? So he says, the Spirit of God. Do you trust the Holy Spirit and his work enough in your life to say, God, even that habit is yours. Even that thought process is yours. God, you want my eyes and my ears and my lips and my hands and my thoughts. You want it all. That's what growing in holiness is. That's what sanctification is. And when you finally say, God, I trust you enough that you can even have the closet, he is sanctifying you holy. Some of you, that closet is bitterness for something that happened in the past, and you're like, you know what, I'll forgive anybody else on the planet, but I will not forgive her. For some of you, that closet is just some money that is set aside that's yours, some way you think about your finances. You say, God can have everything else, but he can't have that. Something that if it was revealed today on the screen, somebody if today, if we wrote your that in the closet, you'd say, oh, take it down. Take it off the screen. I don't want to think about it or talk about it. God's asking you if you're willing to surrender that today. Because he wants the whole house of your life. And that's what sanctification is. I want us to bow our heads together today.